Princess Eugenie's father, Prince Andrew, was once the Queen's golden boy, a war hero. Today he is a pariah, a name synonymous with Jeffrey Epstein and the Pizza Express disaster. Her mother, Fergie, was once the monarchy's breath of fresh air until the toe-sucking scandal turned her into a humiliation. Eugenie is their daughter, the child born and raised at the precise intersection of the two greatest royal catastrophes in modern memory. Her inheritance was not power, it was collateral shame. Denied a formal role and relentlessly mocked by the press, her life has been a quiet struggle for self-worth while carrying a name that had been poisoned. This is not the story of a coddled princess. This is the story of a professional art gallery director, an anti-slavery philanthropist, and the only royal who dares to publicly maintain a friendship with both her disgraced father and her exiled cousin, Heir. This is a story of quiet resilience. The stage for the chaos Eugenie was born into was set in the 1980s. It was the decade of the global media explosion, and no product was more desired than the British royal family. In 1981, the fairy tale wedding of Charles and Diana had launched the greatest reality show on earth. The public needed a sequel, a spin-off, and the palace gave them Prince Andrew. Andrew was the family's star. He was a handsome Falklands War hero, nicknamed Randy Andy, and famously the Queen's favorite son. He needed a bride who could match his energy. In 1985, Diana herself played matchmaker, introducing Andrew to her friend, Sarah Ferguson, or Fergie. Fergie was a breath of fresh air. She was loud, fun, and a working girl, not an aristocrat. The press and public instantly fell in love. If Diana was the elegant ice princess, Fergie was fun Fergie. Their 1986 wedding was a hit. They looked genuinely in love, and their passionate balcony kiss sealed the deal. The reign of the Duke and Duchess of York began, but the cracks formed immediately. Their new home was mocked by the press as South York. After Princess Beatrice's birth in 1988, the core problem was clear. Andrew was an active-duty naval officer. He was constantly at sea. Fergie, who later admitted she was addicted to affection and attention, was left alone. Isolated and feeling the chill from the firm, who found her vulgar, Fergie began looking for warmth elsewhere. The press, which once adored her, smelled blood. Fun Fergie vanished. In her place was the Duchess of Pork. The tabloids began a relentless, cruel campaign fixated on her weight, always comparing her to the elegant Diana. This was the suffocating atmosphere of loneliness and cruelty into which their second child was about to be born. On March 23, 1990, Princess Eugenie was born. She was born into a dying marriage. Her mother, desperate for affection, had already begun an affair with American millionaire Steve Wyatt. By 1991, the marriage was effectively over, but the palace, struggling with the public war between Charles and Diana, demanded they keep up appearances. In January 1992, photos of Fergie on holiday with Wyatt were published, forcing their hand. In March, just as Eugenie turned 2, the palace announced their separation. It was the start of the Queen's annus horribilis, or horrible year. But Fergie wasn't done. She had one final spectacular act of self-immolation left. In the summer of 1992, despite the separation, Fergie was invited to Balmoral with the Queen and her children, but a time bomb was ticking. Weeks earlier, she had vacationed in Saint-Tropez with her new financial advisor, John Bryan. A photographer had captured everything. On August 20th, 1992, the Daily Mirror detonated the bomb. The photos, Fergie, topless, and the defining image, Bryan sucking the toes of the Duchess of York. The scandal turned the monarchy into a global laughingstock. The breakfast at Balmoral story is now legend. Prince Philip was reportedly apoplectic and banned Fergie from his presence for the rest of his life. Fergie was exiled, forced to leave her two young daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, behind at Balmoral. This is Eugenie's primal psychological wound. It was not the tragic wound of William and Harry, whose mother died and was canonized as a saint. Eugenie's wound was shame. Her mother wasn't dead, she was exiled. She wasn't a saint, she was a joke, the most reviled woman in Britain. The divorce was finalized in 1996. Fergie was stripped of her title, Her Royal Highness, and struggled with debt, deepening the shame. But in the single most important decision of their daughters' lives, Andrew and Fergie made a pact. They would co-parent. They became the happiest divorced couple in the world, creating a bizarre but stable island for Beatrice and Eugenie. The outside world, however, could not be kept out. Eugenie grew up with a dual legacy. She was the granddaughter of the Queen and the daughter of the Duchess of Pork. She was not born to be queen. She was born to be a survivor. The tragedy of Princess Eugenie's life is that her story began with an ending. The explosion of the toe-sucking scandal in 1992 was not just the end of her parents' marriage, it was the end of their family's public respectability. For a 2-year-old child, the world is small, a universe of sensations. And the primary sensations in Eugenie's world, from that moment forward, would be the aftershocks of that humiliation, the raised voices, the sudden silences, the sight of her mother, once the boisterous, laughing center of the room, now a figure of public scorn, a woman hunted by the press and frozen out by the palace. The divorce was finalized in 1996, but the arrangement that followed was perhaps the single most defining factor of Eugenie's childhood. It was, in a word, bizarre, and it was, in its own strange way, an act of profound, defiant love. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, the most notoriously divorced couple in the world, did not part ways. They continued to live together. First at Sunninghill Park, the house nicknamed South York, and later at the far grander Royal Lodge in Windsor, Andrew and Fergie established what they would famously call the happiest divorced couple in the world. They were, for all intents and purposes, a family unit. They ate dinner together, they went on holiday together, they presented a solid, united front for their two daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie. This act in itself was a fortress. It was a conscious decision by two parents who had failed each other spectacularly to not fail their children. They were creating a bubble, a small insulated kingdom within a kingdom designed to protect the York girls from the very world that was, on a daily basis, gleefully tearing their mother to shreds. Think of what this taught a young Eugenie. It taught her a lesson that would become her defining characteristic. The lesson was, the outside world is toxic, judgmental, and cruel. The press lies. The establishment is unforgiving. Your only true sanctuary is family. Loyalty in the House of York was not a given. It was a survival mechanism. It was the four of them, Andrew, Sarah, Beatrice, and Eugenie, against everyone else. This bond was forged most tightly between the two sisters. Beatrice and Eugenie became an inseparable unit, two halves of a whole. They were the York girls. It was a brand, a label given to them by the press, and it was not a compliment. To be a York girl in the 1990s and 2000s was to be other. They were not the Wales children. William and Harry, their cousins, were the main event. They were the future. Their story, even in its own profound tragedy with the death of Diana, was a story of destiny. It had weight. It had importance. The York girls' story was a sideshow. It was the scandal branch of the family. They were the daughters of that woman, Dirty Fergie. And as they entered their teenage years, the press having exhausted its cruelty on their mother, simply transferred it to them. This was the second great trauma of Eugenie's life, the inheritance of public shame. She and Beatrice were relentlessly attacked. And not for their behavior. They were, by all accounts, polite, well-behaved girls, but for their existence. They were attacked for their weight. They were attacked for their clothes. They were attacked for their faces. The narrative was set, and it was devastatingly cruel. Diana had been the saint. Her replacement, Kate Middleton, would be the perfect, slim commoner. In this brutal fairy tale, there had to be a villain, or in this case, a comic relief / object of disgust. And the press, with a breathtaking lack of humanity, cast Beatrice and Eugenie in the role of the ugly sisters. This wasn't a subtle subtext. It was at times literally the headline. They were frumpy. They were awkward. They were the Windsor unworthies. Every public appearance, every holiday photo was an opportunity for a side-by-side comparison with their perfect cousins, a chance to point out a fashion misstep or a weight fluctuation. Imagine being a teenage girl already navigating the universal horrors of adolescence, but having your every awkward phase, your every pound, your every new dress dissected as a national joke. Imagine being a princess, a title that suggests fairy tale perfection, while being told by the world every single day that you are, in fact, ugly, fat, and a disappointment. This constant low-level psychological warfare, the shame of their mother, the ridicule of the press, was the backdrop of Eugenie's life. And then at the age of 12, as if her emotional burden were not enough, her body delivered a crisis of its own, a deeply personal physical trauma that would become the central defining event of her entire life. In 2002, Princess Eugenie was diagnosed with severe scoliosis. Her spine was curved, not just slightly, but in a dramatic, debilitating S shape. It was a condition that, if left untreated, would lead to a lifetime of pain and severe physical complications. It was not a minor issue. It was a terrifying diagnosis. And so at the age of 12, just as she was entering the most self-conscious period of any young woman's life, Eugenie had to face the prospect of a massive, terrifying, and invasive surgery. In October 2002, she was admitted to the Royal National Orthopedic Hospital. She underwent an 8-hour-long operation. This was not a simple procedure. Surgeons had to, in effect, break and rebuild her back. They physically straightened her spine and then fused it into its new correct position. To do this, they inserted two 12-inch long titanium rods on either side of her spine, held in place by 8 1.5-inch titanium screws that were drilled into her vertebrae. She woke up in intensive care with a scar that would run the entire length of her back. She was, for a time, confined to a wheelchair. She had to learn to walk again. The pain and the rehabilitation was grueling. We cannot and must not underestimate the psychological impact of this moment. For a child who had lived her entire life as a public object, a symbol of a broken family, her body had now literally broken. Her spine, the very core of her being, was crooked, just as the world had told her her family was. But this is the moment that defines Eugenie. This is the moment the survivor, not the victim, was forged. Unlike the public shame of her parents, which was a trauma inflicted upon her, a humiliation she could not control, the scoliosis was hers. It was her battle. It was her pain. And her recovery was her victory. While the press was outside, still calling her frumpy, she was inside quietly and with agonizing effort teaching herself to stand tall again. She was literally building a rod of steel into her own back. This experience, this personal war, did two things. First, it gave her a profound and very real empathy. She had suffered. She understood physical pain. She understood what it felt like to be broken and to need help. This experience would form the core of her future charity work. She didn't just become a patron of the Royal National Orthopedic Hospital. She became its most fervent, most authentic, and most grateful champion. Second, it gave her an identity. For the first time in her life, she had a story that was not about her mother's toes or her father's absences. It was a story about her own strength. It was the first narrative she ever truly owned. The scar on her back was a secret suit of armor. She had faced a terrifying ordeal, and she had won. The ugly sister's narrative after that must have seemed, in comparison, like childish name-calling. She had titanium in her spine. The whispers of the press were just wind. This newfound quiet internal strength would be necessary because the outside world was not getting any kinder. As she and Beatrice finished their secondary education, another, colder, and more structural rejection was taking place. While the press was a public enemy, a new private one was emerging, their own Uncle Charles, the future king. Prince Charles had a vision as he watched the scandals of the 90s, his own, his brothers, his sisters. He became convinced that the monarchy's survival depended on a single concept, a slimmed-down monarchy. This was a corporate, cold, and pragmatic idea. He believed the public would no longer tolerate the sprawling, expensive Dallas-like cast of dozens of cousins, dukes, and princesses, all living off the public purse. The future, he decided, would be lean. It would be a core group, himself and Camilla, and his two sons, William and Harry. That was it. And in this new streamlined firm, there was no room for the York girls. This was not a media attack. This was a shiv, delivered from inside the family. It was a declaration from the future king that they were not in. They were and would remain on the periphery. Their father, Prince Andrew, was reportedly incensed. He fought, with all the arrogance and entitlement he was known for, to keep his daughters' status. He wanted them to be full-time, senior, working royals. He wanted them to have taxpayer-funded, 24/7 police protection. He wanted them to have prominent roles in grand apartments. It was a bitter, internal family war. Andrew, the favorite son, versus Charles, the heir. And in the end, Charles won. The decision came down. Beatrice and Eugenie would not be senior working royals. They would not, upon reaching adulthood, receive taxpayer funding. Their police protection would eventually be revoked. It was, in every sense, a public demotion. It was a humiliation. It was the palace. The establishment itself agreeing with the tabloids, you are second-rate. And yet this rejection, this public failure by their father to secure their status, would, in a supreme twist of irony, become Eugenie's great liberation. It was the second and most important gift of her life. The first gift was the trauma of 1992, which taught her to trust only her family. The second was this rejection, which forced her to build a life outside of it. Because she was not a working royal, she was not bound by the royal rota. She did not have to spend her life cutting ribbons in provincial towns. She was, unlike her cousins, free. Free to get a real job. Free to make her own money. Free to leave the country. Free to fail. And free to marry whomever she wanted. Eugenie seized this freedom and ran. Her education had already been a step outside the norm. She didn't go to Gordonstown, her father's and grandfather's harsh, Spartan alma mater. She wasn't hidden away. She and Beatrice were sent to Upton House School in Windsor, then Coworth Park School, And finally, Eugenie followed Beatrice to Marlborough College. Marlborough was, and is, a prestigious co-educational boarding school. It was notably the same school Kate Middleton would later attend. But it was not a royal bubble. It was, for lack of a better term, posh but normal. It was known for its arts programs. It was a place where Eugenie, the art girl, could flourish, separate from Princess Eugenie. After a gap year spent traveling, she cemented this identity. She did not go to St. Andrews, the Scottish university where her cousin William had famously met his future wife, a move that was in itself a carefully managed, protected, royal-adjacent experience. No, Eugenie chose Newcastle. In 2009, she enrolled at Newcastle University. This was a statement. Newcastle is a major, vibrant, industrial city in the north of England. Its university is excellent, but it is famous above all for being a party school. It is famous for its nightlife, its Geordie Shore reputation. It was in every sense a normal, messy student town, and Princess Eugenie, granddaughter of the Queen, went to live there, not in a protected off-campus palace. She lived for her first year in a student dormitory, Castle Leazes, a 100-pound-a-week hall of residence, famous for its rowdiness. She was huge. She studied art history, English literature, and politics. She was photographed in the student union. She was seen at the local pubs. For 3 years, she was a student. She was building her own life brick by brick, far away from the toxic glare of London. She was proving to herself that she could be normal. But the press was waiting. The past was never far behind. And the moment she re-entered the royal stage, the old cruel narrative returned with a vengeance. The climax of her humiliation, the moment that crystallized her second-rate joke status in the eyes of the world, came on April 29, 2011. It was the wedding of her cousin, Prince William, to Kate Middleton. This was, in every sense, a global event. It was the biggest royal spectacle since Charles and Diana. It was the ultimate happily ever after, the healing of the wound left by Diana's death. It was the triumph of the new monarchy, stable, beautiful, and perfect. And into this narrative of perfection walked the York girls. Beatrice and Eugenie, then 22 and 21, arrived at Westminster Abbey, and the world collectively gasped. Their outfits were a disaster. They were not just bad, they were aggressively bad. They looked, as one critic brutally put it, like they were going to a costume party, not a state wedding. Eugenie was in a bright blue and purple Vivienne Westwood outfit with a matching hat that was, to put it kindly, severe. But it was Beatrice's hat that became the story. A beige, calamitous, structural creation by Philip Treacy, it was immediately and universally dubbed the pretzel hat. Within minutes, before the bride had even arrived, the York girls had become a global meme. The mockery was instantaneous and it was vicious. They were not just badly dressed. They were once again the ugly sisters. It was the culmination of their childhood trauma. Here they were, at the most important family event of their lives, on the biggest stage in the world, and they had once again confirmed the world's worst assumptions about them, that they were tacky, that they didn't belong, that they were, like their mother, a walking, breathing joke. The humiliation was profound. Beatrice was reportedly in tears. Eugenie, who had just spent 3 years building a normal identity, was dragged right back into the center of her family's public shame. It was the 1992 toe-sucking scandal, remade for a new generation. The details were different, but the message was identical. The Yorks are an embarrassment. For Eugenie, this must have been a turning point. She had tried to be normal and it hadn't worked. She had tried to be royal and she had been humiliated. The press, the public, the system itself seemed determined to keep her in this box of shame. She was 21 years old. She had her degree. She had her titanium spine. And she had just endured a global public roasting. She had to get out. If Britain was going to treat her as a joke, she would go somewhere where she could be a professional. She would go somewhere where princess was just a curiosity, not a full-time job. She would go somewhere her mother's ghosts and her father's battles didn't define the front page. She finished her degree, and in 2013 she did what so many young, ambitious, and quietly wounded Europeans do. She moved to New York City. This wasn't just a job opportunity, it was an escape. It was an act of profound self-preservation. It was the first truly adult step in building her own life, a life that was finally and truly her own. A 21-year-old Princess Eugenie, her degree in art history and English from Newcastle in hand, stood at a profound crossroads. The year was 2011, and the pretzel hat incident at her cousin's wedding had just served as a global brutal reminder of her assigned role in the public consciousness, that of a joke. She was and always would be the ugly sister, the frumpy daughter of the Duchess of Pork. The media had spoken, and in a colder, quieter way, the firm had spoken too. Her Uncle Charles's vision of a slimmed-down monarchy had formally cast her and her sister adrift, cutting them from the roster of future working royals. They were, in a sense, being made redundant from a job they had never even been offered. She was trapped. In Britain, she was a walking punchline, a target for the tabloids who had destroyed her mother. And now, for sport, were turning on her. Her name, Princess, was not a key to a magic kingdom. It was the brand on her back, the very thing that attracted the hunters. She was a woman who could not walk into a London club or go to a restaurant or even attend a family wedding without being subjected to a level of scrutiny and mockery that was, by any human standard, insane. She had to disappear, not to abdicate, but to escape, to find a place where her name was just a name, not a full-time job of public shame. And so in 2013, she did the most sensible, most radical, and most self-preserving thing she could possibly have done. She moved to New York City. This was not a royal tour. This was not a gap year. This was an emigration. She was like generations of ambitious people before her, fleeing the rigid, class-bound, and suffocating confines of her old life, and seeking anonymity in the one city on earth that is too busy, too big, and too self-obsessed to care who your grandmother is. New York was the perfect antidote to London. In London, she was a princess. In New York, she was just another European girl with a trust fund and a funny accent. The city is full of them. She was, for the first time in her life, wonderfully, blissfully, just another face in the crowd. She could walk down the street and no one would look twice. She could go to a bar and no one would take her picture. She had found the one thing she craved more than any crown: anonymity. But this was not just an escape, it was an offensive. She was not there to hide. She was there to build. She had been denied a royal job, so she was going to get a real one. This is the moment Eugenie's story pivots from that of her parents. Her mother, Sarah, when faced with rejection and no income, had turned to the only market she had, her own celebrity. She had sold her name to Weight Watchers. She had done reality TV. She had been caught on camera trying to sell access to her ex-husband. It was a chaotic, desperate, and often humiliating scramble to monetize her own disgrace. Eugenie, the daughter who had watched this her entire life, was determined to do the opposite. She would not sell her name. She would build a career that made her name irrelevant. Using her art history degree, she got a job. A real 9-to-5 entry-level job. She was hired by Paddle 8, an online auction house, a startup, in the fast-paced, high-stress world of the New York art scene. She wasn't a patron, she was an employee. She was, reportedly, a benefits manager, a role that involved logistics, organization, and the unglamorous but essential daily grind. She was, by all accounts, a model employee. She showed up on time. She worked hard. She flew commercial, not private, for work trips. She was just Eugenie, the girl in the office who happened to be a princess. She was proving, not just to the world, but to herself, that she was not her mother. She was not a personality. She was a professional. She was building her own independent value, a value that had nothing to do with her bloodline, her title, or the scandals of her parents. This 2-year period in New York, from 2013 to 2015, was her great quiet rebellion. She was forging an identity piece by piece, far from the corrosive influence of the British press. She was becoming Eugenie the art specialist, a woman defined by her work, her competence, and her own merit. She was, in effect, building a fortress of her own, a suit of professional armor. But while Eugenie was in New York, quietly building a life of respectable professionalism, her father, Prince Andrew, was also in New York, and he was doing the opposite. This is the dark, tragic irony that hangs over this period of Eugenie's life. She had run away from the House of York and its legacy of shame, not knowing that her own father was, at that very moment, sowing the seeds of a new, unimaginably darker and more catastrophic disgrace. While Eugenie was clocking into her 9-to-5 at an art world startup, her father was maintaining his friendship with a convicted sex offender. The infamous photograph of Prince Andrew strolling through Central Park with Jeffrey Epstein after Epstein's conviction was from 2010. The allegations from Virginia Giuffre, which placed Andrew in Epstein's New York townhouse and on his private island, were bubbling just beneath the surface of the mainstream press. Eugenie was in New York building her future, completely unaware that her father was in the same city, actively destroying his. She was working in the clean, well-lit world of contemporary art galleries. He was moving in the shadowy, toxic world of billionaires and underage girls. She was running from a fire, not knowing that her own father was the one carrying the torch. This tragic parallel is the story of Eugenie's life. For every step she takes towards stability, her family's past and future is there, waiting to pull her back down. She was building a fortress of professionalism, but the ground beneath it was seismically unstable, poisoned by the very man who was supposed to be her protector. She was, however, building another, more important, fortress, a personal one, and she had in fact found its cornerstone just before she left for New York. In 2010, during a ski trip to the billionaire's playground of Verbier, Switzerland, a typical York family holiday, Eugenie, then 20, was introduced to a man. His name was Jack Brooksbank, and he was, in every conceivable way, the answer to her prayers. To understand the profound significance of Jack Brooksbank, you must understand who he was not. He was not a prince. He was not a duke. He was not a marquis. He was not a Greek shipping heir or a Russian oligarch. He was not even, in the strictest sense, an aristocrat. He was, in the words of the British press, a commoner, and not even a Middleton-style commoner, whose family had built a respectable £1,000,000 business. Jack's background was even more normal. His father was an accountant. He himself had attended a good but not quite Eton boarding school, and then, crucially, he had not gone to university. Instead, he had done what so many charming, ambitious, non-academic upper-middle-class British men do. He went into the hospitality industry. He had worked as a waiter, he had managed bars, he had become the manager of one of London's most fashionable high-end nightclubs, Mahiki, a favorite haunt of his own future cousins-in-law, William and Harry. When he met Eugenie, he was working in hospitality and dreaming of starting his own wine merchant business. When their relationship became public, the British press, with its ingrained, breathtaking snobbery, was baffled. They didn't know how to process it. A princess dating a bar manager? The Daily Mail and The Spectator had a field day with headlines dripping with condescension. Jack the Lad, the barman prince. They were, in effect, asking the same question. Couldn't she have done better? They had, of course, completely and utterly missed the point. They didn't understand that everything they were mocking, his normal job, his lack of a title, his non-university background, was not a bug. It was the feature. It was the entire reason. Eugenie was not a woman looking for a fairy tale. She was a woman who had seen from the inside that the fairy tale was a nightmare. She was a woman whose entire childhood had been defined and destroyed by volatile, unstable, globe-trotting men. Her father, Prince Andrew, was a war hero, a prince of the realm, a man of immense status, and he was an absentee husband whose own colossal ego and catastrophic personal failings had led to the implosion of their family, and who would in time become a national pariah. Her mother, in her desperation, had run to other exciting men, the Texas oil millionaire, the smooth-talking financial advisor. These men were part of the chaotic, international fast money set. This was the world Eugenie knew. It was a world of drama, of scandal, of grand gestures, and profound instability. And then she met Jack. For a woman whose entire life had been a psychological storm, safe was not a boring option. Safe was the most radical, most passionate, most revolutionary choice she could possibly make. Their relationship was not a whirlwind. It was a slow burn. They dated for 7 years before he proposed. 7 years. They dated while she was in New York and he was in London, maintaining a long-distance relationship. They were building something real, something quiet, and something strong, far away from the cameras. While the press was mocking him as a barman, Eugenie was quietly falling in love with the first truly stable man she had ever known. She wasn't marrying down. She was escaping upward, out of the chaos and the inherited trauma that had defined her parents. This was her great, silent rebellion. It was not a rebellion of slammed doors and public statements like her cousin Harry's. It was a rebellion of choice. She was choosing deliberately and with the wisdom of a survivor, a life of profound, wonderful, glorious normalcy. In 2015, Eugenie moved back to London. Her New York experiment had been a success. She had proven to herself and to the world that she could make it on her own, and she had secured a promotion. She was hired as an associate director at Hauser and Wirth, a blue-chip, globally renowned contemporary art gallery in Mayfair. This was not a demotion. This was a major career move. Paddle 8 had been the startup. Hauser and Wirth was the big league. She was no longer an assistant. She was a director. She was now indisputably a serious, respected professional in the art world. She had built her fortress, a quiet life of work, love, and dignity, a kingdom not of privilege, but of peace. She had her career, her professional identity locked down. She had her partner, her emotional anchor, by her side. She was now 3,000 miles closer to the family drama, but she was no longer a child. She was an adult. She was a professional. She had her own life, her own home, and her own future. She was, for the first time in her life, in control. She was stable. She was secure. She was happy. She was at last ready to be seen again, and this time she was going to do it on her own terms. For 3 years, she lived a stubbornly quiet life. She went to her job, she saw her family, she quietly prepared for her future. And then, in January 2018, After 7 steady, quiet, and devoted years, Jack proposed. The act itself, like everything in their relationship, was perfect in its normalcy. There was no palace. There was no carriage. They were on holiday in Nicaragua, just the two of them next to a volcano at sunset. Jack got down on one knee and presented her with a ring. It was a stunning, blush-colored Padparadscha sapphire, surrounded by diamonds, a design he and Eugenie had reportedly created together, and it bore an unmistakable and surely intentional resemblance to the famous ruby engagement ring of her mother, Sarah Ferguson. This was a profoundly symbolic act. She was not running from her mother's legacy. She was redeeming it. She was taking a symbol of a famously failed marriage, Fergie's ring, and recreating it, reimagining it for a marriage that was built to last. She was saying in this quiet visual way, I am my mother's daughter, but I will not be defined by her mistakes. I will write a different ending. Their engagement was announced just 2 months after her cousin, Prince Harry, had announced his engagement to Meghan Markle. Instantly, Eugenie's wedding was framed by the press. It would not be the event. It would be the other event. It was the B-list wedding, the after party. And then came the reaction to Jack. The tabloids and the snobbish royal watchers lost their minds. A princess? A princess of the blood royal? Engaged to a bar manager? The truth, of course, was that Jack was by then the highly successful brand ambassador for Casamigos Tequila, the high-end label co-founded by George Clooney, and was running his own successful wine merchant business. But that didn't matter. The narrative was too delicious. The narrative was set. Waiter marries princess. The Spectator ran an article with the headline, Is Jack Brooksbank the most surprising royal groom ever? The snobbery was palpable. He wasn't a duke. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't an aristocrat. He was a tradesman. And to the British establishment, that was almost worse than being a commoner. A Change.org petition was launched, gathering tens of thousands of signatures, demanding the royal family pay for the security themselves, stating that a private, personal, and extravagant wedding should not be on the public's dime. Labour MPs spoke out, calling it an unnecessary extravagance and a show of opulence. This was the culmination of the B-list humiliation. The public was, in no uncertain terms, saying, "You are not important enough. You are not worth the money. You are not William or Harry." It was the ugly hat's mockery and the Duchess of Pork disgrace, now rewritten in the cold, hard language of a financial ledger. It was her Uncle Charles's demotion, now ratified by the people. They were telling her she was an unnecessary luxury. For a woman who had spent her life trying to prove her worth, this was a brutal public attack. She had done everything right. She had gotten an education. She had gotten a job. She was self-sufficient. And now she was being punished for the very title she never asked for a role she had been denied. And it was against this toxic backdrop of B-list status, of snobbery, of financial resentment, that Princess Eugenie prepared for her wedding day. She could have shrunk. She could have had a small private wedding to appease the mob. She could have hidden her face behind a veil and just gotten through it. But Eugenie, the woman with titanium in her spine, did not. She decided in a moment of extraordinary clarity and courage that this would not be a day of humiliation. This would be the day she reclaimed everything. She wasn't just planning a wedding, she was planning a personal revolution, and she knew exactly how she was going to do it. She began by talking to the press, but not the tabloids. She spoke to Vogue. In an interview just before her wedding, she deliberately and strategically announced a decision she had made. She wasn't just going to talk about her dress, she was going to talk about her scar. She said, "I had an operation, and I want to honor the people who looked after me and to support a charity I'm passionate about. My wedding dress is a way I can honor them, and a way to show young people who have been through this that we have scars and that it's okay to show them. It was a statement, a warning shot. She was letting the world know she would not be hiding, she would not be ashamed. She was taking control of the narrative before the day had even begun. And then October 12th, 2018 arrived. It was a viciously windy day in Windsor, the guests' hats flying, the page boys tumbling. The world's cameras were focused once again on St. George's Chapel, the same venue where Harry and Meghan had married just 5 months prior. The atmosphere was different. Harry and Meghan's wedding had been a global cultural event, charged with political tension and Hollywood excitement. Eugenie's, despite the A-list guests, felt like a family wedding, and it was a family reunion. Her mother, Sarah Ferguson, arrived. She was not an outcast. She was the mother of the bride, beaming, waving to the crowds, welcomed fully for the first time in 25 years back into the royal fold. It was Eugenie's first victory of the day. She had brought her mother back from her Balmoral exile. Her father, Prince Andrew, still a year away from his own catastrophic interview, was there in all his glory, swelling with pride. He was the father of the bride. This was his vindication, a proof of his daughter's status. The Queen was there, and Prince Philip, the man who had famously vowed to never be in the same room as Fergie, was there. He was 97 years old, frail, but he was there. For his granddaughter, he had relented. All the pieces, all the warring factions of her broken family were in one place, for her. And then the 1977 Rolls-Royce Phantom 6, the bridal car, arrived. The door opened, and Princess Eugenie stepped out. The dress, designed by Peter Pilotto and Christopher DeVos, was magnificent. An ivory jacquard weave silk with a portrait neckline that folded around the shoulders. It was classic. It was regal. But no one was looking at the front. All eyes were on the back. There was no veil. Instead, the dress was designed with a dramatic, daringly low-cut V-back. It was a deliberate architectural void designed to reveal. And there, running down her pale skin, was it, the scar. A faint silvery line, nearly a foot long, running from the nape of her neck down between her shoulder blades. The trace of her 8-hour surgery, the mark of the 2 titanium rods, the 8 screws, the map of her 12-year-old pain. She walked alone up the steps of the chapel, and then, on the arm of her father, she walked down the long aisle of St. George's, her back and her scar exposed to hundreds of millions of people around the world. This was the moment. We must understand how revolutionary this act was. In a world, a family, obsessed with image, with perfection, with narrative control, with never complain, never explain, a princess of the blood royal had chosen the most photographed, most vulnerable day of her life to expose her largest, most profound physical imperfection. This was not a fashion choice. It was a political statement. It was an act of psychological warfare against the very system that had tried to define her. The tabloids had spent 15 years mocking her body. They called her frumpy, fat, ugly. They had ridiculed her surface at William's wedding, calling her choices a disgrace. And this was her answer. She did not reply with words. She did not perfect herself to their standards. She did not obsessively slim down to be a perfect bride. She did not hide in a safe dress. She replied with truth. She was saying, "You want to talk about my body? Let's talk about my body. You want to call me imperfect? This is imperfection. This is a spine that was broken and rebuilt. This is real pain. This is real strength, and I will not hide it for your comfort." She was, in a profound way, exposing her physical scar to heal her mother's psychological one. Her mother, Sarah, had been humiliated by a photograph that exposed her body without her consent. Eugenie was reclaiming that power by willingly exposing her own, not for sexuality or shame, but for strength and survival. She had taken her family's greatest humiliation and turned it into her greatest personal triumph. She was also, in that same moment, confronting the snobbery of the B-list wedding narrative. In one gesture, she made the entire petty debate about who pays seem meaningless. She had elevated the event above the squabbling over money. She had turned it from a royal wedding into a human moment. And she had redefined what a fairy tale princess is. Fairy tale princesses don't have scars. They don't have scoliosis. They are perfect animated 2D drawings. Eugenie stood before the world and said, "The fairy tale is a lie. Life is messy. Strength doesn't come from perfection. Strength comes from showing your scars and standing tall anyway." That dress, that moment, was the summation of her entire life. It was the 2-year-old at Balmoral, surrounded by shame, saying, "I will not be ashamed." It was the 12-year-old in the hospital saying, "I will walk again." It was the 21-year-old, mocked for her hat, saying, "This time, I will show you something real." As she stood at the altar looking at Jack Brooksbank, she was no longer Fergie's daughter. She was no longer the ugly sister. She was no longer the B-list princess. She was Eugenie, the survivor, the art director, the woman with the titanium spine. And she had won. She had finally and completely won. She had reclaimed her own narrative. The tabloids, for the first time in her life, were silent. There was no mockery. There was only awe. The headlines the next day were not about the B-list wedding or the cost. They were about her bravery, her beauty, and her scar. She had changed the story by owning it. She and Jack left the chapel, ecstatic. She had her man. She had her career. She had her broken but resilient family all united. She had had her royal wedding, and she had done it her way. She had found her peace. She was safe. She had exactly 1 year of peace. Because just as she had finally built her house, just as she had finally felt secure, the biggest, darkest, most destructive storm of all was gathering just over the horizon. And this time, it wasn't about her mother's toes, it was about her father. And it was going to make everything she had ever endured look like child's play. The Newsnight interview was just 1 year away. Princess Eugenie's wedding in October 2018 was more than just a wedding. It was a profound personal declaration. After a lifetime of being ridiculed by the tabloid press as second-rate, labeled one of the ugly sisters, and sidelined by the institution itself, Eugenie seized her singular global moment. She did the unthinkable. She requested a wedding dress with a low-cut back. As she walked down the aisle, she deliberately exposed the long linear scar from her childhood scoliosis surgery for 1 billion people to see. It was an extraordinary act of bravery, a symbolic transformation of her physical wound into her adult strength. She had reclaimed the narrative of her own body from those who had mocked it. She married Jack Brooksbank, the kind, stable man she loved, and in the process she married her own resilient and complete self. For one rare, peaceful year that followed, Eugenie lived the life she had craved. She was a respected director at the Hauser and Wirth Art Gallery, a professional in her field. She was a happy newlywed. She was also the co-founder of the Anti-Slavery Collective, a moral purpose she was deeply passionate about. She had built a fortress of normalcy, professionalism, and happiness, seemingly, finally, escaping the chaotic shadow of her parents, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. But that peace was an illusion. In 2019, the Jeffrey Epstein storm hit. The sex offender's arrest and death turned her father's name from a lingering problem into a global crisis. As allegations from Virginia Giuffre and the infamous photograph of Andrew Giuffre and Ghislaine Maxwell resurfaced, Eugenie's fortress was besieged. The irony was horrific and deeply personal. The woman who had dedicated her life's work to fighting modern slavery and human trafficking was now the daughter of the man being publicly accused of complicity with the most infamous trafficker in modern history. Her career and her moral mission had collided head-on with her father's alleged sins. In a desperate attempt to control the narrative, Prince Andrew agreed to the disastrous Newsnight interview in November 2019. It was an act of complete self-destruction. He showed no empathy for Epstein's victims and offered a series of bizarre, unbelievable excuses, most notably his medical claim that he couldn't sweat and his distinct memory of being at a Pizza Express in Woking on the night of an alleged encounter. The interview was so catastrophic that within days he was stripped of all public duties by the Queen, becoming a total outcast. For Eugenie, who had just redefined herself, this was an unimaginable blow. But her reaction was defined by her family's legacy. Just as they had after her mother's 1992 scandal, she and her sister Beatrice did the only thing they knew how to do. They closed ranks. Forged in the fires of their childhood, their loyalty to their father as a daughter, not as a judge, was absolute. They publicly supported him despite the public outrage. As this crisis unfolded, a second one exploded. Megxit. As Harry and Meghan left the UK and were ostracized by the family, Eugenie, who had a deep bond with Harry as a fellow spare, married to a commoner, became the only one to act as the bridge. She was photographed visiting Harry in the US and even lived in Frogmore Cottage, demonstrating a quiet, steadfast loyalty to both the family's pariah and its traitor. The storm truly hit in 2021. In February, she gives birth to her first son, August. But this beautiful act of life happens at the exact moment her family is tearing itself apart. Just 1 month later, in March 2021, her cousin Harry and Meghan Markle detonate their Oprah interview. The family is split in two, the institution on one side, the exiles on the other. But while the world was watching that fire, Eugenie was trapped in a much closer, more toxic inferno. The allegations against her father, Prince Andrew, were not a distant news story. They were a daily, personal apocalypse. Throughout 2021, the legal case built against him in the United States. Then came 2022. This was the year of the execution. In January, her grandmother, the Queen, makes the agonizing decision to strip Prince Andrew of every military title, every patronage. It is a public humiliation. For Eugenie, this is her father, the man who walked her down the aisle, being digitally erased from public life. A month later, he settles the lawsuit. The scandal doesn't end. It just solidifies. She is now the daughter of a public pariah. At the same time, she is trying to be the only bridge left in the family. She is the one person who is still speaking to everyone. She is photographed visiting Harry and Meghan in Montecito, a quiet act of diplomacy. She refuses to choose a side between the warring brothers, a position that must have been incredibly isolating. In June 2022, we see her at the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. She is smiling, she is dutiful, but the family portrait is fractured. Her father is nowhere to be seen, conveniently catching COVID. She and her sister Beatrice are relegated to the sidelines, a clear sign of the new slimmed-down monarchy. Then, just 3 months later, the anchor of the family is gone. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022 wasn't just the loss of a grandmother, it was the loss of her protector. The Queen had, to the best of her ability, shielded Andrew. With King Charles on the throne, that buffer was gone. The new king was making it very clear he wanted his brother out of Royal Lodge, the home Eugenie had grown up in. The walls were closing in. This is the context for the most intelligent decision she ever made. With her family's home base in Windsor becoming ground zero of a toxic scandal, and the monarchy itself in flux, Eugenie did what any smart mother would do. She got her family out. The move to Portugal in 2022 was not just about her husband's job. It was an escape. It was a calculated act of self-preservation. She was choosing to protect her son, August, from the suffocating, bitter atmosphere of the royal collapse. She was prioritizing her role as a mother over her status as a princess. While in Portugal, she builds her new life. In May 2023, she gives birth to her second son, Ernest. She is for a moment free. She has her husband, her 2 children, and the relative anonymity of a life abroad. She has successfully found the third way, neither a full-time duty-bound royal nor an angry exile. But the royal family wasn't done with her. The beginning of 2024 brings a crisis no one saw coming. The slimmed-down monarchy suddenly breaks. King Charles is diagnosed with cancer. Her cousin, the Princess of Wales, is diagnosed with cancer. The 2 main pillars of the new reign are out of action. Suddenly, the firm looks dangerously understaffed. By mid-2024 and into 2025, we see a subtle shift. Eugenie is back, but on her own terms. She's not a working royal, but she is a working family member. She appears at a Buckingham Palace garden party alongside Prince William, a quiet show of support. She is the reserve player, called off the bench because the main team is injured. And so, we are left with a royal story unlike any other. The story of Princess Eugenie is not a grand tragedy. It's a quiet, complex lesson in endurance. She is not the fire of her cousin Harry, who burned his bridges to the ground. Nor is she the ice of the institution bound by a cold and rigid duty. Born into the public shame of her mother, raised under the media's relentless mockery, and finally forced to stand in the shadow of her father's catastrophic disgrace. Any one of those burdens should have been enough to crush a person. But Eugenie did not break. Instead, she took the physical scar from her childhood surgery and forged it into a spiritual armor. She took the rejection of the slimmed-down monarchy and used it as a passport to freedom, to build a real career, a real life, and a stable, loving family. She remains the only bridge left standing in a family that has collapsed, the only one who dares to publicly maintain a friendship with an exiled Harry, and the only one who stubbornly offers a daughter's loyalty to a pariah father.